Hey everybody, Professor Dust here, and today we're going to talk about negotiations. So I've got this divided up into two different types of negotiations. As you'll see as we get through the material, it's really important to differentiate between these two different types. First, we're going to do distributive negotiations, and then we'll talk about integrative negotiations. I really love this material because it's just very practical. I mean, as soon as you walk away from this, you'll be able to apply some of these strategies, tactics, and eventually when we get into integrative negotiations, some of the mindsets that you'll need in order to be successful. And if you really think about all of our interactions throughout day-to-day life as well as work, a lot of them are transactions, negotiations, essentially, right? What are you trying to offer and what do you want in return? So let's dive right in and first start with a definition. So a negotiation is a decision-making process, right? There needs to be some end decision that is made, and then it has to involve two or more people. So it could be 2 people, could be 10 people, could be 10 different parties, right? Negotiations can happen at the geopolitical level where you have representatives of 20 different countries coming together to negotiate. It can get super complicated, but today we're just going to talk about some of the simpler, basic, fundamental attributes of different types of negotiations. And then as you get into more serious type classes that are just focused on negotiations, for example, we have an entire course on negotiations that we offer for undergraduates at Farmer, and you can kind of really see all the different variables that are involved when you have subgroups and multi-group negotiations. So anyway, 2 or more people, and then it has to be about the allocation of scarce resources. Maybe that's money. Maybe that's money for a certain good or service. Or maybe it's something way more complicated than that, where there's multiple things that you're negotiating for with multiple parties. And, a lot of times we put this into dollars and cents and we try to make it simple into the terms of something quantitative like money. Sometimes it's not so easy to do that. And that's kind of the 201 level of negotiations as well. So when you're getting into negotiations, a distributive negotiation, the goal is to make sure, if you're the buyer, that you will not go over a certain point, and if you're the seller, you will not go below a certain point. So anytime you're getting ready to get into a negotiation, you have to think about a reservation point. This is different from a goal, right? A goal is what you're hoping to get, and we'll talk about aspirations later. The reservation point should happen before you get a negotiation. This is your walk-away point, where you basically say, I know in advance, based upon my research, that if I'm the buyer, I'm not going to spend more than this, or I'm not going to, if it's not in dollars and cents, I'm not going to go this far given these terms. And then the seller does the same, right? And so a lot of times what people do is that they kind of go into it and they have a vague understanding of what the reservation point is. And then they get into the negotiation and they flop because they'll deviate from it. The other party convinces them that they need to based upon some rationale, or they just feel emotionally invested, or they're investing so much time and energy in it, and then so they kind of give in from the reservation point. And so a key question is, what happens when you don't have a reservation point? Well, you end up getting attached and wanting to make it happen. And so go into it with purpose and always have a few different things set up. But number one is a reservation point, a walk-away point. If you really have done your homework and you've done your research on the situation, you shouldn't be worried about walking away because you know in advance that that's the right thing to do. And the challenge with distributive negotiations is that we're trying to figure out what the bargaining zone is, and ideally there's an overlap, and we'll visually show this here in a second. So a bargaining zone is the space between a buyer's reservation point and the seller's reservation point, right? Those 2 points we just talked about. I won't go over this, I won't go under this. And so ideally there's overlap between the two, where the buyer is willing to pay more than what the seller wants, and you have this range, this positive bargaining zone. But a lot of times that doesn't always happen, and you end up having a negative bargaining zone, right? So remember, it is totally fine to have a no deal, right? If the seller and the buyer have done their job and done their homework and there's no overlap, then a no deal is the best scenario because you're not satisfied. The challenge, though, is that you're trying to really understand if there is a positive bargaining zone or not, and you don't really know in advance. And then you're also trying to figure out how big is that positive bargaining zone so you can grab as much of it as humanly possible. And so there's limited information, right, when you're getting into a negotiation. And I think savvy negotiators a lot of times will try and provoke the other party to tell them what their reservation points are so that they can go straight for the kill and garner as much of this pie as humanly possible. So I like to think of it as in this visual of, we don't really know whether it's a small pie, a big pie, or there's no pie at all, right? So if there's no pie at all, let's walk away. If there's a big one, right, if you can figure out what the other party has as their reservation point through your research, through your questions, you might have a better chance of grabbing as much of that as humanly possible. So the key question is, how do I figure that out? Well, number one, just ask, right? See if they'll tell you. Why not? Or go indirectly and ask third parties, or through priming, through questions, try to get them to at least give signals as to what their reservation point is. And so if you ever walk onto a car lot, for example, and I mean, used car dealerships get a pretty bad rap, and a lot of times rightfully so, that they're just kind of hagglers, and all there are is like haggling negotiators, and they're trying to get the most of this pie as they possibly can from you. But if you walk onto a lot and the salesperson, the first thing they say is, how much are you thinking about paying? I mean, what are you trying to pay today? Or how much do you have available that you're interested in spending on a car? They're asking you what you're willing to do, and they're getting at this idea of your reservation point. So be careful. Now, if there is any one piece of advice I can give you for winning negotiations, it would be to remember this acronym, BATNA. BATNA stands for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Think of your BATNA as your next best offer. It is your ultimate form of leverage. Okay. So if you have an offer, for example, at a different company, and that offer is 20% more than you're currently making, right? You have a really good alternative here, right? Something that, and this is just one factor is the salary. If you go to your current employer and you say, hey, I'd like to talk about salary. I feel like I've worked hard. I've been here a while, and I've been, hitting my objectives, and I feel like I'm at that point where I might deserve a raise. And can we talk about that? Or maybe it comes up in the performance review. If you don't have another offer, what leverage do you really have? Maybe they're worried about losing you because you're unhappy, or maybe, they really just want to, motivate you, and they're willing to give you that money. But really the best lever for trying to, earn more is to simply say, hey, I've got a better offer over here. If you still want what I'm doing, then can you match it or exceed it? And so that's a pretty extreme example, but if you get in negotiations, these BATNAs become super helpful. So for example, if you're, again, back to the car lot, ideally what you do if you're getting to buy a car is, if you have, I want a Toyota Prius. And so you go to the Toyota dealership, and you're looking at all the new Toyota Priuses, and they say, what are you willing to spend? And I don't know. And you get into this negotiation based upon the sticker price. If you're able to say, hey, the blue book value says that I can find this elsewhere for this, or I just went down the road and found a Ford Focus, it's relatively similar car, it's kind of same mileage per gallon and same features, blah, 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 and it's $10,000 less, right? Can you make me a deal here on this Prius or not? If not, I'll go over here. Or go over to the used car lot and tell the new car salesman, hey, I could go buy a used version of this car that's got 10,000 miles on it for $10,000 less. I mean, either make me a deal on the new car, or I'm just going to go over there, right? Those are your alternatives. I think a lot of times we get in negotiations and we think that talking and our ability to be persuasive and charismatic and influence is really going to push the other party into doing something that's more beneficial for us. It doesn't work, right? Research clearly illustrates that the best way to win a bigger part of the pie is through Batnas. If you have better alternatives and you can leverage those in the negotiation, every time you are more likely to be successful. And so really negotiations are not won and lost in the moment of the negotiation. Negotiations are won and lost in the preparation, in the research, in tracking down other alternatives so that you can bring them to the table and say, here's what else I'm going to do if you can't make a deal here today. Now let's talk about another thing that you should be considering before getting into a negotiation is aspirations or goals. And so research is really clear on this too, that there's a positive correlation between aspirations and outcomes. So if you're setting your goals relatively high, you're going to have a higher likelihood of getting an outcome. And the reason this happens is kind of psychological, in that when you know where you want to be and someone offers you something that's not near there, that's just an example, your initial reaction might be to be upset or to show signals that that's not going to work. Where if you didn't have high aspirations, your reaction might not be as strong. And then the other party knows that, okay, well, we're getting close here. So when you set aspirations, it changes your psychology. It changes your reactions. It changes your behaviors. It changes your nonverbals. And so when we have these aspirations, it plays a role into how we interact with others during negotiations. But here's the catch. You can't just have crazy off the charts aspirations. They have to be aggressive but realistic. And so, if they're completely unrealistic, then the other party is either going to be offended or walk away and just assume there's no way we're going to make it work. And you might then not have a deal at all. But you do want to be aggressive, right? If you have goals that are set too low, then you're leaving something on the table, right? So figure out how to make aggressive but realistic goals. Another important idea is anchors. Anchors are essentially whoever's going to come in and make the first offer and where that first offer is on the continuum of where you might end up, whether low to high on whatever the degree is, whether it's money or some other factor. And the reason anchors are so important is that research has been really clear that we get psychologically stuck on whatever the first offer is. So sometimes we think of these as like low ball, high ball offers. You may have heard that terminology. Those are different circumstances. Those are kind of extreme anchors. And we'll talk about extreme anchors in a second. But good anchors can be beneficial, and it can ensure that the negotiation skews towards your side of the range. But we'll go back to low ball and high ball in a second. There are those circumstances where you want to offer the anchor. So if it is an information-rich situation, right, that this arrangement is probably going to land in this range from, I don't know what we're negotiating on, the purchase of a building. The market research is clear. It should be between 1 million and 1.5 million, right? We know based upon all sorts of comparables and, publicly available information, both parties know that this building should go between 1 and 1.5. That's an information-rich environment because you both know that. If you know that, then you want to be the one who sets the anchor, right? Let's say you're the buyer and you know the range is 1 to 1.5. You want to get right in there and set the anchor as close to that 1 million or maybe even a little bit below that 1 million as possible. And the reason is because when you set that first anchor, their first counter will probably be closer to your end than what it would have been on their end. And same if you were the seller and you were to make the anchor on your end. Now, the challenge, though, is that if it is not an information-rich environment, you really don't know where you should end up on this specific arrangement. You do not want to be the person to set the anchor. Because if you don't really know where you're supposed to end up, and you set an anchor that's way too high, then it's not going to work. And they're going to get upset, or they're going to think this is ridiculous, and they're going to walk away, and you might not have a deal. If you set an anchor that's way too low, then you left money on the table accidentally because you just didn't know where you should end up. So as a general rule, you should think about information richness first, and then decide whether or not you want to be the one to set the anchor. If you are the one to set the anchor, know what that range is and come slightly below what that range is. Now, dealing with low ball or high ball offers. This would be, for example, if you're you're trying to buy a building and you and the seller know that it's supposed to land within this 1 million to 1.5 million based upon the comparables. If the seller comes in and says, I'll give it to you for 3 million, you know that that's ridiculous. That's off the charts. That's a high ball offer. Your reaction should be one of two things. Number one, laugh, literally. Because what you're signaling is that you can't be serious, right? This isn't actually the negotiation yet. You're just messing with me. And so essentially brushing it off to say, yeah, right. I mean, we're not even going to start the negotiation. We haven't even begun yet because that's just crazy. And then the other scenario that you could play out if you were getting a high ball or a low ball is to just do the opposite of what the other party did. So if someone gave you a high ball of 3 million, then you react in the exact same way and give a low ball offer way on the other end and say, no, I'll buy it for $200,000, right? And so, and that can create a little bit of angst, and it might take forever to finally get to where you need to be within range of the 1 or 1.5 million. But the theory is, if they're going to be crazy high on their end, you be crazy low on your end, and you might eventually come together in the middle. Okay, so that is anchors. Next is concessions. And so the goal in concessions is, not the goal. I would say concessions is about this offer counter offer process. It continues to go back and forth, right? That's just the way negotiations typically work. Like, for example, with a job offer, maybe you go back and forth twice. Buying a house, I think the average might be like 4 times. With a car, it's probably 4 or 5 times, right? So there's going to be some back and forth. And so what you want to do is recognize that in advance. You don't want to go in exactly where you think you're going to end up. It's just this, that the dance is going to take place. And so you should make yourself some room to make the appropriate concessions. Now, it is one strategy that's out there to just simply say, I'm giving one offer and this is my final offer, give it or take it. And there's some pros and some cons to that, right? You're getting rid of a lot of the time and a lot of the potential excess cost from getting into this conversation. But at the same time, a lot of times people won't engage and they'll just walk away from the opportunity. And so the important part is that you're signaling through the size of your negotiations that you're getting close to your reservation point where you're no longer gonna continue to negotiate. So, for example, let's say you're buying a house and you put in a $250,000 offer and the other party counters. And it doesn't matter what that counter is. And then your first concession is to go down to $225,000, right? So now you've gone down $25,000. And then the other party counters. And then you now go to $212,000, and then they counter. And then you go down to $2,005,000, right? So you started out with 25, then you were about 12, and then you were about 7 or something like that. And so you're getting closer and closer as you're shrinking your counter offers. And it's signaling that, hey, I'm getting really close here to not being able to do any more for you. I'm reaching my reservation point. And that tends to work well in all negotiations where you don't want even increments throughout, because that's signaling that you'll keep going. But you make your biggest one first, and then you get smaller throughout. Another important part is that you always make bilateral concessions, never unilateral. So if you make a concession and the other party doesn't also make a concession, then literally just put a pause on the negotiation until they're willing to give some type of counteroffer. what happens a lot of times is that people will offer a concession. Oh, I'll go down to 225,000. And the other party says, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. Okay, well, I'll go down to 215,000. I'm sorry, that's still not good enough. Right? That's not a negotiation. That's a unilateral negotiation. You're negotiating with one person. They're supposed to go back and forth to be able to decide where we're going to meet in the middle. Right? So if they're not countering, then you need to make the statement of, well, I'm just going to hold off right here. And then, I understand you don't like the counteroffer that I made. I'm doing the best I can. Maybe we can talk a little bit more. But I can't offer you anything other than what I just offered you unless I get a signal from you on what you think. So always wait and never negotiate with yourself. Integrative negotiations. For this one, is a little bit more complicated in that now, for one, it's not just one issue. It can be multiple issues. And it's also not as simple as just trying to argue over the size of a defined size of a pie. Now, it's possible that you might have even more than that. You might be able to have trade-offs. You might have integration. So it's a little bit more heady. And I would say when you get multiple parties and multiple issues, this is a little bit more realistic as opposed to just looking at one item at a time between two parties. So what exactly is it? It usually involves multiple issues. So not just salary, for example, but it also includes your signing bonus and your commissions and stock options and vacation days or whatever, right? So it's not just salary. It's like all these other things that could potentially trade off. And it's not a fixed sum game. You can expand the size of that pie. If you can find things that are trade-offs that might not necessarily be readily apparent and not maybe initially included in the negotiation terms, that's the ideal game, but it can be hard to uncover some of those. Sometimes you'll have compatible issues and both of you want the same thing and you got to figure out what those are. And then sometimes you have integrative issues where you can cooperate and you can trade off, right? You really want this and I really want that. So let's kind of both do whatever makes sense for both of us and we can both benefit. So it's definitely more complicated. There's more going on and more moving pieces. And what you're looking for is what's called the Pareto efficient agreement, where you've looked at every possible scenario, right? All sorts of different levels for all the different issues. And there is no situation that would make any party better off without decreasing the outcomes to the other party, right? So it's like, okay, we've found this Pareto efficient agreement. And if we make one change, then there's going to be one that's doing better than the other, or we both go down, right? You want both to be essentially maximized, hitting that ceiling. But in the Pareto inefficient agreement, which unfortunately is a lot of times where people end up because they just couldn't get there. They couldn't figure out where those ideal integrations were to maximize the size of the pie. And so here's the negotiator's dilemma, though. And they actually call it the negotiator's dilemma. Anytime you're trying to create value by creating those cooperative opportunities, creating those integrative opportunities where you both can expand the size of the pie, you're signaling to the other party what you really want, and they can potentially claim some of that value for themselves. Let me give you an example first. So let's say you both want vacation days. And organizations might say, we know based upon our research that employees that take a minimum of 14 days a year of vacation have a much less likelihood of burnout, right? And so they want you to take 2 weeks of vacation, paid vacation. And then the employee, they come to the negotiations table and they want the same thing. They want as much vacation day as possible. And so in the negotiation, maybe the employee says, hey, I take 2 vacations a year. Each one is 7 days. I know that's a lot, for my first year to come in and ask for 14 days of paid vacation. Is there any way that, we can build that in? And the employer, who's on the other side of the negotiation, they want the same thing. They also know that that's going to help them as well. But if they were to say in the negotiation, once the potential applicant or the potential employee says that they want it, if they were to say, ooh, 14 days, ooh, I don't know, that's a lot. Let me see what I can do. And if they use that kind of as a bargaining chip and say, sure, we'll give you those 14 days, but you're going to have to take a little bit of a hit on your salary, right? So that's the negotiator's dilemma. As soon as you're exposing what you really want, the other party might capture it for themselves. And so you have to figure out how to get at those opportunities for cooperation and integration without being taken advantage of. So the first thing is build trust and share information. So you don't want to share too much, but you do want to share enough information to help the other party understand that, I'm trying to do what's in the best interest for both. Ideally, we figure out how to make everybody happy. And another thing you can do is ask questions, and that you're trying to ask questions that are saying, what are you really looking for? What are your priorities? What's most important for you? And so coming up with ways that are getting at understanding kind of what their prioritization is or point value is for certain variables within the negotiation, without just flat out asking them to tell you what their priorities are, which exposes them to be taken advantage of. Another one is giving away some information, but not all the information, right? So instead of telling them, how much you're willing to forego in salary to do something else, you might just, signal that that's really important to you, right? So you can be careful and give away a little bit of information without giving away everything all at once. Make multiple offers simultaneously. So sometimes it is advantageous to say, here's offer one, here's offer two. Here's the terms for offer one, here's the terms for offer two. Which one do you like better? And that can kind of signal the direction without, again, the person just, flat out saying, here's my list of priorities and exactly what I want. Now, please come up with something that makes the most sense. When you're negotiating, you can also look at 2 items at a time. You might say, instead of just negotiating over salary and then saving the other 8 dimensions that you're eventually going to negotiate over, take 2 at a time. Say, how about this salary and this signing bonus? Does that sound like something we can agree on, and then move to the other things, right? So doing multiple issues at a time. And then another important one is to always search for post-settlement agreements. So with integrative negotiations in particular, if you know that there was an opportunity to expand the size of the pie, then why not, after the negotiation has been settled and it's all in writing and everything's underway, if you uncover something that could have been taken advantage of, why not offer a post-settlement negotiation, meaning kind of an addendum to whatever the negotiation was, right? It doesn't have to officially be over if you find opportunities for creating more value. And do your best to, before the negotiation, prioritize your interests. And then as you're getting into the negotiation, prioritize the interests of the other party, because then you can get a feel for some of these prioritizations without flat out asking. And again, exposing everybody to that potential for taking advantage. And the final set of recommendations, if I had to take a step back and summarize the number one thing to do, is just to be cautiously cooperative when you have integrative negotiations. And building trust and sharing that information and just trying to ask the right questions. And ideally, it's something that both parties recognize that we're in this together. We can create win-wins. We can be more integrative and cooperative, but it's going to take some work to kind of build some trust to get there, right? So being cautiously cooperative to make sure you don't get taken advantage of is kind of the mantra when it comes to integrative negotiation. So know the difference between distributive and integrative, and keep in mind that not all of the distributive negotiation tactics would work very well within an integrative negotiation. Know what some of those factors are for the distributive negotiations, the ones that are very important, right? So each slide has a few that are recognized, aspirations, Batna, etc. Know what those are, be able to pick those out of a lineup or to interpret them, and then understand exactly what integrative negotiations entail, some of the challenges of those, and hear how to overcome some of those challenges. So hope that helps. Good luck with your negotiations. Thanks.